What do you, should I, you know, we don't know each other that well, actually, we've just seen each other a couple of times, but I must say I'm a big fan of your work. And for one of the reasons is that we share a common interest in comparative nationalism in the 20th century in Catalonia, in secessionism. You wrote a book, for instance, I think it was your dissertation, a monograph that is entitled The Nationalism of the Rich, Discourses and Strategies of Separatist Parties in Catalonia, Flanders, Northern Italy and Scotland. Right, so I think you had two cases for your dissertation. Did you expand it?
No, it was for
it was 4 cases, but you definitely cover the 4 usual suspects in that literature, and it's a very interesting thesis. And actually, I was familiar with that book before we actually got to meet, and I got to invite you for that talk. You have a PhD from the Graduate Institute. You were working on a project on minority protection and the myth of homogenization in the interwar years with Davide Rodogno, and Davide Rodogno actually came here. He was the first to hold a presentation in that exact same format, and the project was very interesting back then, and the talk was very interesting. So, you know, the bar is pretty high, and I hope you did it. You know, working on a very similar project. Yeah, the title is quite similar, but it's a Marie Curie Fellowship, which you hold at the Complutense in Madrid.
Yes.
And you've been pretty much all over the place. You've been to the US, you've been everywhere in Europe. And what I like perhaps particularly, and what I find 2 reasons why I'm really glad to have you here. The first one is that you are an interdisciplinary scholar, but it's not just a statement. You do it and you publish in different fields, and that's quite impressive. And just to give you an example, we even published in Political Theory. You have an article that is on the principled logic of or underlying arguments raised by political parties for secession in Catalonia, which you wrote with a great scholar who was a sociologist, if I'm not mistaken, Serrano, between a principled and a consequentialist logic, theory, and practice of secession in Catalonia and Scotland. And this is actually an article in Political Theory. So you are a historian, we can actually pull off articles in political theory. And I think you also have an article with quant scholars, I know, with my friend Michel, and so hardcore political scientists. And so we really actually show that interdisciplinarity is not just a word. And for that, you should really be praised. The last thing that I would like to say before I let you speak is that we are just about to launch the 3rd phase of the NCCR. We will have a revamped version of our migration history talks, and I really hope that, you know, post-COVID, and because we have some people at the NCCR who are very, very prolific and good historians, we'll manage to get that collaboration, you know, work even better. And I actually have, will be co-directing with my colleague Mulle, who couldn't stay, a project on immigration, regional immigration. And your paper is absolutely great because it shows that it's actually potentially a good idea. Few people believe it is, but thanks to you, I think you will definitely illustrate that immigration is one tool. It's part of the toolbox of the state for fulfilling a range of purposes. In that specific case, it's about national homogenization. We could think of other purposes, but it's certainly the distribution of the population in a given territory is actually, and I hope we will be able to prove it in some years thanks to your work and the work of our PhD students and our postdoctoral students, we will be able to prove that it's actually among the key functions of the state, right? And concerns and functions of the state. So that's what I have to say about you, and now we're very much looking forward to the talk. Usually you get about 30, 40 minutes, and then we will have a chat with the audience.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation first, for the introduction. It was very kind words. And I'm very glad to be here today and to discuss this paper with you. It's a paper that has been through different revisions. It's also, in a way, in part a collective work, not this specific version, but earlier versions, and in general, the broader project that I will briefly present at the beginning of the presentation. It's a collective project. So how can I...
And we'll just put it on full screen, like this, and then diaporama. So it's actually, you don't mind if it's recorded?
No,
then
no,
we air it on YouTube.
Yeah,
I must confess that few people watch it, but you know,
Yeah, no,
for now.
So, shall I sit then?
Yes, please sit here.
Okay.
We haven't asked your Ramon, but maybe in the discussion.
Sorry, there are some people online.
Now
I
it
can
could
see.
be.
Yeah,
Maybe.
we can
Maybe.
complete
In
that,
the
and then
end.
I can start the presentation if you want. You want to?
We can, when he asks a question, we can.
When he asked a question to introduce himself, we could do it. Sorry, I don't even see actually the screen because
The camera is off, so we don't know what he's doing.
Alright, so I also before starting wanted to say that I'm not actually a migration scholar. I mean, I've worked on, as Jean-Thomas was saying, I mostly worked on nationalism studies, the history of nationalism. More recently, the last 3-4 years, I've focused on minority-majority relations, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, in the paper, but also about broader research at the beginning of the presentation. But I recently started getting acquainted with the literature on immigration for a future project that I have to work upon. And there I started seeing some connections with the specific case of fascist Italy and the way the regime tried to homogenize some minority populations in some border areas. And I think, and that's what I'm trying to do also in the paper, I think we can make a connection between migration and homogenization and treat migration as a tool for homogenization, and I'm looking forward to your comments on that. I'll be mostly talking about the specific case, but before doing that, I will briefly introduce the context of this research, and also I have to acknowledge the contribution of some of my colleagues. So the project that was at the Graduate Institute, and I'll present in a minute, is a project that I worked upon with Dalle from the Graduate Institute that Jean-Thomas mentioned, but also with Mona Billing and Alessandro Ambrosino, who were two research assistants in the project. And they both helped me a lot, especially with sources in German that they master much better than I do, and that's also something that I wanted to acknowledge. I think maybe they might be online, I might watch it later. So first I'll present briefly the broader project, and then I will talk about, very briefly about Italy, make the studies on immigration in Italy, and why there is a kind of blind spot, I think, there in the literature, because these specific policies that I will introduce have not been connected to the broader literature on immigration or migration in general in Italy. Then I'll briefly introduce what I think was a little bit the framework of fascist authorities during the regime towards these minorities. I refer to the concept of consistent ambivalence. And I also talk about lack of resources as one of the main drivers of one of the main forces that shaped the policies, or actually the ineffectiveness of some of the policies. But I really try to argue that there was this consistent ambivalence throughout the interwar period, and the way they tried to manage this population, tried to go about the Italianization of these areas, and I explain later what I mean by consistent ambivalence. And then, in the second part of the talk, I focus on three ways in which migration was used to promote the homogenization of these areas, which, as you can see, is also kind of escalation in terms of how radical they were, from favoring immigration to promoting internal migration to forcing to some extent, although we see that that was partial, at least in the intent, and then also in the outcome, forcing the immigration of part of the population of, in this case, South Europe. And then provide some brief conclusions. So, to go to talk about the context of the research. So, the broader project is a project about minorities in Western Europe during the interwar years. And when I mean Western Europe, we use 3 case studies: Belgium, Italy, and Spain. I can tell you more about the choice of the case if you want in the Q&A. The starting point is the fact that, as you probably already know, at the end of the war, there was this question of minorities in Europe. Again, I can give more details about this later if you want, but it is quite clear that self-determination became one of the main principles of political legitimacy, and because self-determination couldn't be realized in actual terms, because there was never a perfect coincidence between political borders and national forms of identification. There were several populations that didn't necessarily identify with the state where they were living, therefore this question of minorities. the League of Nations and the Great Powers created an international system of protection of minority rights supervised by the League of Nations, and they imposed it on countries of Eastern Europe, mostly because these were new states or states that had lost the war, so they didn't have enough negotiating power in Paris. But that was also because there was kind of stereotypical understanding of these countries as not able or not enough capable of managing diversity within their borders, and also that heterogeneity and minority questions were an issue that was limited to Eastern Europe. To give you a very brief example, one of the most important experts on minority questions and also on nationalism at the time, Caroline McCartney, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 1931 entitled "Minorities: A Problem of Eastern Europe." So the idea was really that Western Europe didn't have a problem with minorities because Western European states were homogeneous, homogeneity and modernity went along at the time. And however, somehow this bias has been reproduced in the literature, at least in the international literature. So we have a lot of regional literature about specific cases that treat them as part of regional history. We don't have so many works that put these stories in connection to each other and to Eastern Europe. There are some, and especially recently there have been people who have talked about this. Volker Prout wrote a book about this. Tarazar in 2008 wrote a great article about comparing Alsace-Lorraine and the Czech borderlands, but there isn't a lot. So the point of the project is to somehow shift the focus of the attention from east to west in order to try to also to depathologize to some extent the east, which is it's a word that has been used a lot by experts of the Habsburg Empire, but also by Rogers Brubaker, for instance. So the idea is to treat Western European states as a nationalizing state, and among these, of course, Italy. Now, the project relies on this idea of, this Brubaker's model about minority conflicts. Probably you're aware, you know these models. So he states basically that majority minority conflicts are a result of interaction of different actors, notably nationalizing states, minorities, and external national homelands. So I rely a lot, we in the project relied a lot on this. We also modified it a little bit, and this somehow can be seen also in the layers, in different layers of analysis. So we look at state policies, and I try to provide a visual representation of each layer. So the first layer would be just looking how different countries treated minorities. And here you have a very somehow monolithic understanding of minorities and majorities. So the very solid black and very solid red that allows us somehow to compare policies across countries, but it's not very accurate. Because then when you focus on the regional level, and that's the picture on the right, and that's the second level of analysis, and try to look at the relationship between minority organizations and representatives and the local population, you see that the picture was much more fluid. Of course, there were a lot of people who spoke Slovenian and Croatian in Venezia Giulia, and they were, to some extent, locally speaking, a majority. But there were also people where it was difficult to understand how they really identified, and they also had feelings, but they probably identified nationally more with the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes there in Italy, but that didn't mean that they necessarily wanted to be part of the kingdom, or that this had political consequences regarding redentist feelings or something similar. And then the last level of analysis is the transnational level, so basically the interaction between people in the specific region at the state level, but also outside, so mostly in terms of influence by foreign states, but also in that how it's a little bit different from Brubaker's model, taking into account also the mobilization of civil society through international organization and what would be today's NGOs, so private organizations founded by minority activists and other members of civil society who are interested in this minoritization. So this is just briefly the broader context of the project. Now, to go to the specific case of Italy, as I said, I think there is a link to be made with this history of Italy as an immigration country. So Italy has been studied mostly as a country of immigration. Some statistics talk about 26 million immigrants from 1876 to 1976. One scholar in the mid-1990s said that no other country has contributed as many immigrants to the world than Italy. I'm not sure that he is correct, especially by now, but in the mid-1990s. That was a claim that could be made in the literature. So just to show you that Italy has mostly been studied as a country of immigration. More recently, also as a country of immigration, but mostly as a country of immigration. And I think there is this blind spot because the fascist regime somehow used migration as a tool, and I'll try to explain how in the rest of the presentation. Now, some context more linked to the specific paper and the specific case that we are looking at. So, Italy came out as a victor from the First World War, and at the Paris Peace Conference, so it was given some territorial annexation that it was promised before entering the war. And these mainly consisted, I mean, the picture is more complex, but the two main territorial annexations are those two regions that you can see in the map there. On the map there, South Tyrol, so on the in the center on top, which was inhabited by 200, more or less about 200,000 German speakers and in former Habsburg subjects. And on the right, Venezia Giulia, or how it was called by the Italian state, Venezia Giulia, which was inhabited by 300,000 more or less Slovenian speakers and about 160,000 Croatian speakers. Again, those as well former Habsburg subjects. There were, of course, also Italian speakers who were former Habsburg subjects, but the state was much less concerned about those because the assumption was that German speakers and Slovenian Croatian speakers didn't really completely identify with Italy, and so even if Italy wanted to annex these areas for, especially for military strategic purposes, in reality they kind of internalized the security problem because then the feeling they had about their grip on the region and the legitimacy of the Italian state in the region was always pretty shaky. Now, as I said, many of these didn't really identify, although again, forms of identification there were pretty fluid. However, in most of these cases, it is clear that a substantial part of the population, if there had been a referendum, for instance, most likely wouldn't have voted to be part of the Italian state, but that doesn't mean that it was open, very violent, or very strong resistance. In most cases, people accepted this choice, and for instance, some of the representatives started negotiating forms of autonomy. During the liberal period, although Italy had no formal obligation under international law because it was not covered by that minority protection system that I mentioned, the liberal Italian government promised to respect the right of minorities. In a way, they did it, although the picture is more complex. I can come back on that if you want. But what's important for today is that these, of course, changed completely when Mussolini and took over and the fascist regime actually began. So here I'm making the argument that the policy of the fascist regime towards the minorities was basically structured around consistent ambivalence. And what I mean by this consistent ambivalence is that this policy was formed by two elements that were in tension with each other, even really clear contradiction, I would say. The first that you see in quite a lot of internal reports, external propaganda in quite consistent way, although of course I'm not arguing that there were not people who had different ideas and opinions about the minorities, but you can see in very many archival records that there was this assumption about the inevitability of the assimilation of the allogeny. And allogeny is a term that I use a lot in the paper and I use in the presentation because it's the term that was used at the time by the fascists to define Italians of non-Italian origin. So there is an idea of kind of ethnic difference in there. It's not very, it's a term that is not very clear, it's not very well defined, but it's the term that was used most of the time to define people who were considered members of minority populations in these new provinces. Now, as I said, there was this idea of the inevitability of assimilation, and this for two reasons. The first is that one assumption was that these were not really Germans or Slavs, as they were called, so Slovenian speakers, Croatian speakers, but they were Italians who had been Slavized or Germanized during the previous century by the Habsburg Empire and by other local populations that somehow invaded the area and then Slavized or Germanized the local population that originally was Italian. So there was this idea that if you scratch a little bit the surface, there will be this Italian nature that will come back somehow. And many internal quotations, you can see the idea of the need to reawaken this allogeny to their original Italianness. Here there is a quotation from Mussolini from the Ascension speech in Parliament in 1997 that basically says that, you know, in South Tyrol there are no really German speakers, these are Italians somehow, and it ends, I didn't report the last part of the quote, when it ends saying, there are Italian speakers Italians who have to rediscover themselves, to realize that they are Italian. And the other part of the assumption, the other element that made up this assumption of inevitability is that even if they were not really Italian, as you know the first part was assuming, the Italian civilization was so powerful that in the end they would have just accepted that they had to assimilate because it would have been better for them. So there was this hypertrophic discourse about national grandeur settled, like basically structured around the force of the Italian culture that somehow motivated this assumption. This, however, was in tension with a second element. Before I go to the second element, just briefly, because it's important for the second part, by the end of the 1920s, many fascist authorities, both in the provinces and at the center, started realizing that assimilation wasn't really happening as they planned. However, they mostly justified this with the work of so-called agitators, so a few weak individuals, mostly paid by foreign powers, that somehow were preventing the local population to assimilate as they should. And at the same time, they also realized that they had to diversify their policies, and they had to use different tools, and that's where migration started to be used. So from the late 1920s and then throughout the 30s, we will see three instances of how migration was used. And the important point is that they somehow represented a novelty and innovation in the repertoire of policies, but at the same time, they were never really meant to replace more traditional assimilation policies through, for instance, schooling, the imposition of Italian school in the public place, the Italianization of names, also both name of places, but also name of people. Family names were Italianized in these areas. They never really replaced completely these policies, but they were conceived as a complement. So the idea mostly was that through immigration or internal migration, or even forcing external migration, the demographic balance in these areas would be changed in a way that it would favor the absorption or the assimilation of the allogeny. As I said, there was a second element that was in contradiction, and this is that basically many fascist authorities, and you can see that especially in reports from, prefects or fascist leaders in these provinces to the center, but also in the replies that they were getting, many fascists fundamentally distrusted the allogeny. So there is this tension between they have to assimilate, we want to incorporate, actually there is no alternative, they will be part of the nation, they will be integrated in the body of the nation, but at the same time we fundamentally don't trust them. So this tension is basically the basis of this consistent ambivalence that I think informed the policy of the fascist regime. And I give you just two examples of this distrust. I could give you also many others, but there are two, I think, really personal stories that I found in the archives that have been also treated by the secondary editors that show pretty well what I mean by distrust. So, for instance, the first is the story of Maximilian Markart, who was a German speaker, who actually joined the fascist party, was a committed fascist, and was the podesta of Merano. Podestas were basically appointed mayors, that was a figure introduced by the fascists to replace the mayors, and were appointed by the regime. So he was the podesta of Merano. He had an excellent record. You find in his folder in the archives that he was praised by most other local authorities, also by members of the Central Party in Rome. He was an outstanding administrator, apparently. But there were always pressure, especially on the ground, especially in the province, to replace him because he was a German speaker. And he managed to stay in Merano as a podesta for a while, because he was replaced in the mid-30s. But already from the mid-20s, late 20s, you see in the archives and exchanges about these pressures, people who wanted to replace him and people who were defending him. And one of the people who was defending was the sub-prefect of Merano, Isuni, who wrote a very interesting letter to the center in which he basically said, if we give to good Italian citizens of German nationality the impression that we always and systematically distrust them because of their nationality, we will fatally remain few and isolated individuals in a bluntly hostile environment, which is pretty much what happened within hindsight. So there was this idea that allogeny in positions of power were always suspicious, and there would be always pressures to somehow replace them, and often they would be successful, even if in the case of Marquardt, that took a while because he stayed in his position until the mid-30s. Another example, Albino Furlan, an allogeno, or Italian of Slovenian origin, in Venezia Giulia, in a small village called Marruchino, much less important as a position than Marquardt, but he also, in his record, we find a lot of witnesses of high esteem from colleagues. He was a teacher and also the member of the local branch of the Fascist Party. Apparently, he managed to increase the local membership of the Fascist Party from 5 to 8 people. Despite all that, in 1933, he was forced to move from his village in Venezia Giulia to Perugia, central Italy, in the framework of a wider purge of teachers of Slovenian origins that the regime thought were and couldn't be trusted. The case goes to the Central Party. The vice president of the Fascist Party is somehow moved by his excellent record and tries to convince the Minister of Education to make an exception. The Minister of Education tried to force the prefect of Trieste to accept that Albino Furlan could be able to come back, and the prefect actually refuses and replies in the letter in which he motivates the refusal, saying teachers of Slav origins, even if moved by the best intentions, cannot carry out in this province, for reasons of kinship, relations, and environment, the delicate task of Italian and fascist educator. So even if we can trust a single person because of the environment, we cannot really trust them in those positions, so we have to move them somehow. So these are just, I think, two very good illustrations of how this deep-seated distrust was part of the thinking of many authorities within the regime throughout the interwar period. Now, why is this relevant at all? I think for two reasons. One, as I will show in the second part, it influenced the way in which migration was used. And although, as I said, we also need to take into account a further element, that is the lack of resources or the resource constraints the regime had in order to implement radical policies. And the other is that most authors in the literature on nation building or interethnic relations, or also citizenship studies, distinguish between modes of incorporation that are based on inclusion or exclusions. There is always this continuum between open and closed, inclusion and inclusion. Somehow, some authors, for instance, Erin Jonas, propose to differentiate, because policies of inclusion can also be quite violent in some terms, in the sense that they force minorities or immigrants to abandon the cultural script of their own culture of origin. So he proposed to distinguish between assimilation, exclusion, and accommodation. But if you try to fit the fascist approach within these three categories, or within this simple inclusion-exclusion continuum, you wouldn't really be able to fit it, because there was a component of incorporation, but at the same time, they were marginalized in a position as second-class citizens, as people who couldn't fundamentally be trusted. So I feel that this idea of forced inclusion and latent segregation is something that is somehow not completely taken into account in many of these frameworks, although of course there are authors that have made similar consideration. For instance, Milton Gordon has talked about structural integration and cultural integration, the idea that the two could be decoupled. Recently, Catherine Rodriguez has also talked about the paradox of assimilation in these terms, and again with reference to this case, but without elaborating too much in theoretical terms, Roberta Perger has talked about the allogeny as individuals that were integrated but as second-class citizens. Now, to move to migration. So how migration was used, especially from the late 1920s, when frustration about assimilation was somehow emerging within the regime, to promote the homogenization of these areas. As I said, there are three policies that were adopted, and I think they somehow represent also a kind of escalation in the way, in how radical they were, although they were never really completely, they never reached let's say, level as radical as, for instance, in other contexts. Let's just think of Nazi Germany, for instance, but even less radical regimes. But still, I think you can see an escalation. So the first is this idea of letting the allogeny emigrate, especially in the region of Venezia Giulia, between more or less 1927 and 1932, a little bit later. So what happened is that the immigration policy of the fascist regime was pretty much in line with the liberal, those of the liberal regime until more or less 1926, 27. So more or less laissez-faire, or in any case not promoting but accepting immigration, and try to keep also let's say the doors open in immigration countries. And then in 1996 things changed. In a way, it was a way for Mussolini to find a way out of the restrictionist turn in some countries, for instance the US, but also Mussolini started being obsessed a little bit with this idea of the Italian nation as a decadent nation, and so immigration was formulated as a loss for the nation, both in quantitative and qualitative terms. So from June 1927, Mussolini basically ordered the prefects to stop giving passports liberally, to try to really restrict the flow of immigrants out of the country. And a few months later, the prefect of Gorizia wrote a message to the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying, basically, here we have noticed that the allogeny of this province are emigrating in great numbers. This has increased. And this is putting the nationalist Slovenian movement in the countryside in a difficult position. We should just let immigration do its own work. And so basically he was proposing to make an exception. And 10 days later, Mussolini sent a circular within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then later to the prefect, saying basically we should actually we shouldn't hamper the allogeny that wants to emigrate, and shouldn't stop them from doing so. So basically, there was an exception that was made for that. Now, this hit especially the region of Venezia Giulia, mostly because this phenomenon of spontaneous immigration was much stronger there than in South Tirol in those years. And there are three important elements of this circular. The first is that it was secret, so it was not an official policy of the regime. It's something that had to be somehow be done, but surreptitiously. It is not totally clear from internal records why that was the case, but two main reasons can be at least guessed. One is that somehow it was already in contradiction with this idea of assimilation, because promoting immigration meant getting rid of them because assimilation hadn't really worked or not as well as the regime wanted. And the other one is diplomatic relations. Although diplomatic relations are not basically not creating protest on the part of the Yugoslav kingdom, but that's something that didn't stop the regime from already implementing very strong and violent assimilationist policies before, like closing all schools, expelling teachers, and so on. Second, it was about favoring those who wanted to emigrate. It was not about pushing people to emigrate in the first place. So it was really about just accepting and letting go of those who wanted to leave. And third, the circular referred to permanent immigration. And here is quite important when you look at the numbers, because the estimates, which are very contested, and I can come back on those later if you want, but the estimate is that about 100,000 people out of an overall population of about 500,000 emigrated during those 5-7 years, more or less. So quite a substantial immigration. But most of it, as you can see, about 70% emigrated to Yugoslavia. And when you look at the archives, the immigration to Yugoslavia was not favored by the regime. So when you look at the actual implementation, the prefects were against that because it was considered circular migration in most cases. So people who would go to the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, get radicalized, as the fascist authorities thought, and come back to Italy to somehow act as agitators. So they wanted to somehow stop that flow and favor the other flow that you can see there in numbers, that is the flow to Latin America and especially Argentina, about 20% of those who left. And that was the permanent immigration that was considered profitable and positive by the regime. Now, two things are very important here. The first is, on one hand, the regime couldn't really implement the policies as it wanted, because it couldn't stop the flow of people who wanted to go to Yugoslavia, or rather, it couldn't stop the return flow. Because if it had been effective in stopping the return flow, probably it would have left people leaving to Yugoslavia because it wouldn't have been a threat. But since it couldn't, it had a problem in managing that flow. The other important element is that within when you look at the implementation from internal records, you see that this policy was justified as getting rid of agitators, although it's not clear why only agitators would move and not others. And always this idea that the policy was not about replacing the population, but like actually upsetting the balance, changing the demographic balance to favor the absorption. And actually in the records at this specific moment, 27, 28, you see 29, you see in the first records of implementation, you see that the prefects were suggesting to bring Italians from other regions, we will see that's the second policy, to these areas to repopulate them somehow. And also, you see always this idea that, okay, we are just getting rid of the agitators, and that's good for the regime, but we have to survey, to actually survey very well to control the local population because it can be easily agitated. So there was this idea that, people were resisting just because of the action of these few external actors or these few agitators, but at the same time, the mass would be easily agitated, and so that's why it was always suspicious. The second policy was about moving pure Italians, so Italians from what at the time were called older provinces, so those were already part of the kingdom before the First World War, and somehow settle them in the two regions, in the two provinces. That started in the early 1930s, especially from 1931, when an agency, the Italian is called Ente di Nascita Agraria delle Tre Venezie. So it's basically an agency for the Renaissance, the cultural renaissance of the three Venices, because at the time there were three regions. One was Venezia Giulia, the other one was Venezia Ogana, it's the area of Venice, and Venezia Tridentina was the Italian name for the area of Trentino and South Tyrol. So this ente, which was conceived, at least in official propaganda, as an ente with a wider purpose of land settlement, colonization. There was a policy during the fascist regime of ruralization, so officially, although not in fact, the regime was promoting the distribution of the population more broadly in a more scattered way on the territory, to try to promote also this kind of middle-sized, small-sized properties against big land properties. So officially that was the purpose. And in internal propaganda, in internal messages, you see that although the purpose was clearly to buy land from the allogeny, to sell it to Italians from the older region, the older provinces, officially it was about buying land to promote middle, small-sized properties and so redistribute it to poorer Italians, regardless of their ethnic origins. That was the official discourse, but actually the real one was another one. Now, the effort and the properties were these kind of properties that you can see, for instance, in the picture. This is a farm, as it was called in South Tyrol, Amazo, in South Tyrol, and this is one of the properties that was bought by the ONC, Organizzazione Nazionale Combattenti. This was an association of former soldiers that collaborated with the regime on this task. It didn't really work in the sense that at least from the fascist perspective, the result was not as good as the regime had expected or because, as you can see, they managed to buy only 0.6% of the productive agricultural surface of the provinces. And to give you a comparison, another land redemption program that was not linked to ethnic reasons, but was about redeeming land that was were basically marshes for agricultural purposes, was Agropontino in Lazio. It basically redeemed and distributed about 8 times the land that was bought in the new provinces. So why it didn't work? The main reason in that case was mostly insufficient resources, and in the records you find also quite funny stories about the problems that these agencies that were managing these programs, these schemes of acquisition of land and redistribution encountered. So one first problem was they didn't have enough resources, and often they competed with German buyers that had that were somehow supporting for nationalistic purposes the local population and providing their own sources of funding. They also had difficulties in running the farms that they were both, because often they didn't find farmers that were skilled enough to run these high mountain farms, especially in South Tyrol, which became the focus of these attempts in the 30s, in the second half of the 30s. And at some point in some of these cases, you find letters in which the local managers were asking the central administration whether they could rent the farms to German speakers because they couldn't find farmers somewhere else in Italy that were able to run the farms and make them profitable. One of the main problems was that many of these farms were not profitable, so they should have been supported by subsidies. And many of the farmers who were actually sharecroppers were writing letters saying, we are bastions of Italianness here, we are defending the nation, you should help us. And basically the treasury or the central offices of the organizations that were running the schemes were saying, no, you have already too much debt, we cannot fund you enough. We cannot fund you anymore. So this, you clearly see that resource constraints really hamper this effort to buy land and redistribute it to older Italians from the older regions. Also, as I said, land colonization were always complementary to the older assimilation policies that were adopted, like the Italianization of schools, geographical names, and so on, and the public space. So the effort was important, but there was never a moment in the regime in which they said this is the only and primary policy we're going to use. It was one among other elements. It became much more important during the 30s, but it never became the absolute priority. There is one exception, which is the construction of the industrial zone in Bolzano, the city of Bolzano, which was the main city, the capital actually of the province of South Tyrol. And that actually somehow worked in the sense that, in the fascist perspective, because the population, the Italian-speaking population, went from 21% to 62% between 1921 and 1939. But that was not enough to change the overall outlook of the region, or it didn't have an overall impact, to have a major impact on the Italianization of the overall province. And here you just have this picture of four men that apparently are so innocent, where actually basically they were inspecting land that had to be expropriated to build the industrial zone, and it was land owned by German speakers. And then the third way in which migration was used was through a population transfer agreement, basically with the German government. So this population transfer agreement, that's called the option agreement, was agreed by the Nazi government and the fascist government in June 1939. The immediate background is the Anschluss. So when basically the Anschluss was realized, Italy was to take it a little bit from before. When the Nazi regime came to power in 1933, there was always much suspicion on the part of Mussolini that Hitler wanted to somehow get a foot in South Tyrol because of his declared policies of reintegration of German minorities within the German Reich. Although Hitler always said since Mein Kampf actually that he was ready to sacrifice South Tyrol for an alliance with Italy. But Mussolini really never trusted this, and also once Hitler came to power in South Tyrol, a pretty strong Nazi movement arose and started campaigning for the reintegration of South Tyrol within Germany. So with the Anschluss, this option became actually not that inconceivable. So also because Italy and Germany were becoming very close allies, they decided somehow to take a radical decision to somehow solve the issue once and for all. And the idea was that basically the population of South Tyrol had to decide whether they wanted to stay in Italy and basically behave as good Italians, so basically abandon any pretext whatsoever that they would be reintegrated somehow into Germany, and basically stop any kind of propaganda, or opt for German nationality, German citizenship, and move north of the border, north of the Brandenburg, so the change would not be in the territorial belonging of the region, but people would just move north of the border. Now, this, of course, was a tragedy for the local population. There were families that were divided by the decision whether to stay or to leave. There are many letters in the archives that describe, from a social level, this problem. The main fracture was between optanten, those who wanted to opt and move, and Dabblers, those who wanted to stay. Now, the main side that is interesting for us is how the Italian authorities behave, and this behavior was very odd behavior, not really understood by people at the time, and not so much by researchers today. So there are many interpretations of why that happened. So basically, while the German authorities started campaigning from the immediately, basically from July, immediately after the agreement, secretly or not, but they were trying to push somehow the German-speaking South Tyroleans to opt for Germany, in part because they needed workforce for and soldiers for the economy and for the war effort that was already being planned, and in part because they wanted a political victory to some extent against Italy. The Italian authorities didn't do anything, more or less, until September, October. So there are different explanations. There are people who say they wanted a full transfer, so they left the Nazis spread propaganda. Among this propaganda, there were rumors that all those who would stay would be moved to Sicily and Sardinia, or that they wouldn't, they would be deprived of their farms. And you see letters in the articles, people actually believe those rumors. So some scholars say it's because they wanted a full transfer, so they let them the propaganda spread. But then that doesn't explain why in September, October they completely changed and they started somehow to try to convince people to stay. There are economic reasons that are cited, and certainly that was a problem because one, people who moved had to be compensated, and the compensation would come from the Italian state. And there were negotiations, endless negotiation between Italian and German authorities on the actual amount of money that they had to pay for each different type of property. But in the archives, you don't see that mentioned as often by the Italian authorities. And also the other more important economic problem that they realized after the end of the auction, because there was a term people could decide to opt to December 1939, they didn't really mention ever the fact that if the entire population of South Tyrol would move, who would just run the economy? That never crossed their mind until in 1940 they started actually thinking about it, and they were kind of not panicking, but you don't find much of it. So I think economic factors were important for sure. I mean, that was probably always in the back of their mind, but you don't see them mentioned so much in the internal exchanges. One element that hasn't been emphasized so much, or by not so many authors, is this idea of national prestige. And again, I come back to this idea of consistent ambivalence, because actually recognizing, already agreeing with Germany that there will be a population transfer agreement was an implicit admission that assimilation hadn't worked. But accepting and even forcing a total transfer would have been going even too far. And even more than that, when you look at, actually, for instance, especially the prefect of Bolzano, Mastro Matteo, who's here in the picture, and who was in charge more or less of all the operations, he wasn't expecting the population to leave in mass. So if you look at the correspondence, both in the negotiations with the Germans in May, June, and then also later, because some details were fine-tuned later in September, October, what the Italians were aiming at were 10, 20, maybe 30,000 people. So they wanted always to get rid of these agitators and then keep the rest of the population. And again, Mastro Mattei in August in internal correspondence was writing, well, probably 30,000 people will leave. If you want some more to leave, because maybe we need, we think we need more, we should push them to go. While in reality, already at the time, already in August, September, there were reports coming in from members of the political police or from Carabinieri, from local authorities that were saying, actually here it looks like people are voting in mass for Germany. Then in September, October, that became clear also to people like Mastro Mattei, for instance, and then they changed completely their tack. And for instance, here you have a picture of a speech, very important speech that he gave in November of 1939, which basically was saying, you can see all those who will stay here, nobody will do you any harm, you will be treated as Italian citizens as anybody else. But at the same time, always because of this, the second element of this consistent ambivalence, he couldn't either sign, he and other fascists couldn't sign a blank check to the allogeny. So basically, the discourse was always, all those who stay here and behave like good Italians, which nobody knew what it meant, but you could imagine that, you couldn't claim to have a school in German, for instance, or any other forms of recognition of the local culture, would be treated like Italian citizens on a par with the other. So there was always this element that they couldn't really make, turn completely their policy in order to try to convince the Allogen to stay after having ignored the German propaganda. And also they didn't collaborate with the leadership of the group, the local group of those who wanted to stay, the Dalle, because those who were leading the group were the old German-speaking leaders that they had basically tried to either expel or to limit in their political activity. So to conclude, as I said, I think we can look at migration as a tool in the repertoire of that the fascist regime used in the new provinces to homogenize the local population. We can see an escalation. So immigration became a tool and was used because there was frustration with the previous policies that were adopted. So mostly the Italianization through imposition of the Italian language in schools, in the public place, and this went from favoring spontaneous immigration to promoting internal migration to forcing partial immigration, especially in this case in South Europe. So, as again, these were radical measures and escalatingly so, but never intended really to replace completely assimilation. And as I said, these were impacted or structured by this consistent ambivalence that I presented at the beginning of the paper. And somehow the fascists were victims of their own rhetoric and at the same time of insufficient resources. And here I would like just to read you a last quote that I have here that doesn't come from those I had in the presentation. This is a quote that comes to show you how even after the option agreement, in the option agreement 86% of the population of South Europe voted for Germany. In the end only a third moved because at the same there were problems with the negotiations concerning the compensation, and also many of these South Europeans in the end wanted to vote against the regime for Germany, but didn't intend to move actually. So they dragged their feet after the vote to try to stay, hoping that at some point Germany would take over actually, which is what happened in 1994. But even after that, Italo Sauro, who was a member of the regime, very high-profile member of the regime, was like the main referent for ethnic affairs of Mussolini in the area of Venezia at this time, not South Europe, talking about the fact that after the war it would have been better to move the population. He was proposing to move actually the population of Slovenian Croatian speakers from the border because of the war effort, and that would have somehow secured the area. But he still was believing in assimilation, and he wrote to Mussolini, "We should not believe to gather soon and everywhere the fruits of the assimilation effort. The lower the level of progress of the populations, the more effective the policy of nationalization and assimilation." Here, because the Slavs were considered lower culturally than the German speakers. For Istria, the area of Trieste, part of Umagrizia, especially the province of Isonzo, and some centers of Dalmatia, the time when we'll see excellent results, the results is not far. Later, much later, but certainly, we will see them also somewhere else. And this is an internal report to Mussolini, it's not official propaganda made in a public speech. So you still can see this illusion of inevitable assimilation holding even after an event, for instance, like the option agreement that sent a shockwave, or should have sent a shockwave in the regime. That's it. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Right on time. We have about half an hour. I was supposed to discuss your paper in great length, but I don't think I will. We can do it at dinner because I'm sure there are many questions. If there are not enough questions, then I will be happy to fill in. But it's probably good to give the audience a chance to ask questions. Anyone?
No, I would like to. Yes, thanks first for a very illuminating issue, and with also a narrative of radicalization, basically, of the attempt to homogenize areas in the north and the east. And I think it's what I particularly like is the whole project, because you are comparing Italy then also to Spain and to Belgium in order to see if there is only the eastern part which has problems with minorities and migrants, as this was basically one of the assumptions and also um, stronger ideas of Hannah Arendt when she wrote her book on Right to Have Rights, basically referring to the situations of minorities who were not protected nowhere. And for that reason, I think it's very illuminating in order to see how different countries were referred. First question I was asking myself in listening to you is to which extent the Weimar Republic is Eastern or West, because also the Germans before 1933 had also problems with, and even before World War I, had strong problems with minorities. And Rogers Brubaker has written extensively on their assimilation policies, which also failed in the 19th, early 20th century. So the question obviously is why Italy and why not also Germany? Obviously, why not Switzerland is obvious, because Switzerland, in order to mirror the attempts of their northern and southern neighbors, had to find an own policy how to maintain also the national myth of being diverse and to confer also to a very, very minority, the Romansh, the own language status, as a reaction also to the Italian policies in the 30s. But my question I would like to ask you is, because I think this was also in the title, homogenization, which refers to the idea that the nation state is basically able to create the idea, not also the imagined idea of a common nation.
Yeah.
But the story we are telling is basically the story of the failure.
Yeah.
It's not happening. Not even in a fascist Italy, which could have all means to realize. So the idea of homogenization is basically, it comes from an historical narrative, which all, particularly social scientists, like very much, in order to see this state as a monster. But it's not able. But it has also monstrous possibilities, obviously. But it was not able to realize what the principle or the idea was. This is my first reflection on what you told. The second is, if Italy wouldn't have been fascist, what would have happened? There are different options. One option is colonies. It's also a form of colonization. And obviously with Ethiopia and Abyssinia, Eritrea, but also Libya, it will be interesting to see to which extent the policies which were done in liberal Italy before World War I and after had similarities with the population move, transfer, which Mussolini and his consorts were doing. Also as a reflection. The other one is, I think, the other idea or the other imagination I had was the remark you were saying about the Anti-Immigration Act of the US in 26-27, which obviously played a role also in the appreciation to which extent immigration as the population policy of Italy, with millions of people left. To which extent these had also an impact, maybe not to these areas, but to maybe this is maybe a wrong reflection. To which extent it would have had an impact to the policies they decided. But probably this is too minor because these were particular regions in which I don't think that these policies could have.
Oh, no, well, I don't know whether I can jump in.
I think no. Go ahead.
I don't know whether you had other. I don't know whether you had.
Yes, sure. Go.
Well, just to very briefly on this, because I think I just wanted to make a very quick comment on that. So I don't know. I don't think necessarily it would have changed a lot the situation in these two provinces, but it seems as if Mussolini's move would have probably made anyways, because this idea of Italian as a nation that was decadent, and in some way Italy had to do something to either stop migration, or the broader picture was to actually then somehow find an outlet for Italian immigrants within an Italian empire, which is the project that was realized to some extent in the mid-30s. That probably would have happened anyways, but the fact that there was a restrictionist turn in some countries, mostly the US, somehow prompted Mussolini to do it a little bit earlier. Some interpretations say this. And then with the restrictionist turn, of course, we see the policy of letting the allogeny go. Because if there is no restrictionist turn within Italy, the allogeny will just go like all the others. So to some extent there is a link, although it's very indirect, I would say. To reply to your 3, I would say, other questions. So the failure of homogenization is, you're totally right, and actually at some point, because the idea behind this, I would like to write a book, and there are these 3 levels: state, regions, and international. And at some point, one of the ideas I had for the title was the history, like subtitle, the history of 3 failures. Because one is the failure of the regimes, or some of these, not all, but some of these, to homogenize the population. The other one is the failure of the minorities, or at least the representative of the minorities, actually obtain the recognition of the rights. And then there is a failure of the international community more broadly, at least, though that part of the international community, civil society, that was mobilizing for these rights. So you are absolutely right that we are talking about the failure of the history of failure, that states don't necessarily get to homogenize populations, and actually in let's say the most successful cases are those in which they don't necessarily try. Although I think, and this is one of the points of the project as well, I think you see a tendency towards some kind of homogenization, even in a case like Belgium, that was probably the most democratic regime of the 3. Maybe that somehow the Spanish Republic for a few years was, in that respect, a little bit better, but not necessarily. But even in Belgium, you see that tendency in a much softer way. So I would say, I don't know whether we can call it really homogenization, but if you look, and for this case, we look at Flanders as a kind of sociological minority, because although it was a majority, it had a claim that was very political claims that were very similar to those of a minority. In the 1930s, you see basically the Flemish politicians and Walloon politicians decided to divide up the country in 2 monolingual areas. So they had 2 options. One was bilingualism throughout the country, and the other one was Flemish in Flanders, French in Wallonia, and of course bilingualism in Brussels, and they went for the second option. So you see a linguistic homogenization, although it's very much softer. It's an homogenization in terms of administration and schools, that you see also in other regions imposed throughout on the entire minority population and throughout the country. So I think you see that, but always in Belgium, for instance, you see accommodation towards the German-speaking minority in autonomy. And if you compare that to South Tyrol, I think you can make the claim that a more accommodative regime, although it doesn't obtain perfect results, because there is no linguistic homogenization. But in 1939, at about the same time when in the option agreement, 86% of the Italian citizens of South Tyrol vote for immigration to Germany to acquire German nationality. Couple of months before, in the summer of 29, in Belgium, you have a general election, and you have a revisionist, mostly Nazi party, the Electoral Front, that gets 45% of the vote. So it's still a lot, but it's not 86%. The 2 are not necessarily comparable because there are different issues at stake, but I think to some extent they show that the Belgian approach, in a situation that is quite similar, because it's a German-speaking minority, smaller, 70,000 people, but not incomparable, especially in proportional terms with the overall population that in Belgium is much smaller. The outcome is much more in favor of Belgium. So I think there you can make a claim about homogenization, whether it works, whether we are just projecting, or whether there are some regimes that actually look for it, or some others that look at not necessarily at homogenization, but at other forms of integration or through accommodation. Then, if Italy had not been fascist, what then? It's a very good question. I think if you look at the liberal period, you see it's a very complex period, very fluid. There is a degeneration of policies towards what happens then with fascism. There is a difference much more marked than in the fascist regime between South Tyrol and Venezia Giulia. In Venezia Giulia there is much more violence for a number of reasons. The population is more intermixed. It is considered as inferior culturally speaking and in terms of status than the South Tyrolean German-speaking population. And there is also a coincidence to some extent. It's a kind of partial overlap of social issues and ethnic relations, because a good part of the Slovenian political, let's say, a good number of Slovenians were active in socialist and communist organizations. And so the fascists acted as, were accepted as a repression tool by local entrepreneurs and conservative forces against the socialists, and therefore also against the Slovenian movement. You don't see that in South Tyrol because the population of South Tyrol is overwhelmingly Catholic in political terms, not just in religious terms. So, however, at the same time, for instance, South Tyrol, you for at least until mid-1921, end of 1921, you see a regime that keeps in place completely the Habsburg legislation. You have a situation in which the Habsburg laws are in force in South Tyrol, but they are not in North Tyrol, because in the Austrian Republic changes everything. You have schools in German, you have, so it's a situation in which you have much more different shades of grey, I would say, and it's hard to say how it would have been evolved, but you know, the generation that occurred from mid-21 to then October 22 and later somehow was also the result of the fascist mobilization that brought violence to Venezia Giulia first and then also to South Tyrol, and the liberal authority didn't really, their main focus was not to react strongly against this and accepting it in the end. So I think a liberal Italy would have treated the minorities better, and probably it would have had fewer issues, although it would still have had some issues. But yeah, liberal Italy was also very short and fragile regime, so I don't know whether we can really draw a conclusion.
Any other questions? Because we have 15 minutes.
I would have a bit of random questions, but first of all, I would like to understand what do you consider these regions, because in the literature it seems to be a bit divided between edges of empire or borderlands. Mm-hmm. So I think both convey different things in a way. Like I think you try to go a bit away from Perger's argument regarding the indeterminate sovereignty with borderlands. But that would be my first question. What do you consider this region? Edges of empire or borderlands? Then, while I was reading your fascinating article, I was always going back to this idea of ambivalence that you focus so much, and to which extent this idea of consistent ambivalence is actually a trait of empire. Because, for example, Anne-Laure Stoller, she talked about zones of ambiguity, and if this kind of premeditated ambivalence, so to speak, would be in a way a zone of ambiguity of empire. Then this is a bit random, but I was feeling, and going back to this what if, I was feeling while I was reading that we didn't get a lot about these agitators, and perhaps it could have been helpful also to avoid a bit that kind of standards contextualization that we see in this topic. That goes back to the 1866 with I think it was Cataruzza that wrote about it. So to avoid a bit that kind of contextualization with this chronological logic, I would have liked to know more about these agitators and how they are basically inherited by the Italian state or nation empire from this provincial patriotismus of the Habsburg Empire, and how they basically how they inherited it, because even if it was not fascist, the problem would still stand in a way. So that would be my two comments, questions.
Yes?
Yes.
Two. Okay. Whoa. Well, first, there are great points, and actually I'm not sure I can answer to all of them, because I think it's really food for thought. Well, first, the question about borderlands, edges of empires, and your reference to Perger's work as well. To me, I like Perger's argument that, you know, this distinction between empire and nation state, it's too clear cut and should be somehow challenged, and you can see elements of the inequality of empire within nation states and vice versa. And as I said, Perger is one of those who recognizes the idea of incorporation of the allogeny with the idea that at the same time they were put in a kind of marginal position, and she says pretty clearly they were incorporated, but as second-class citizens, and they had to remain in that box to some extent. To me, I'm not sure we can qualify after 1919. We can qualify these areas as edges of empire. To me, they become borderlands because this focus changes completely, and until 1935 it remains like this, at least. So, to me, these are better treated as borderlands because the international context changes and define them much more clearly as borderlands. But I think I will need to give more thought to this distinction. So I thank you for that. And also because I have to be very quick. Then the consistent ambivalence is a feature of empire, yes, but I'm not sure whether you refer to the idea of national indifference or you refer to the idea of ambivalence on the part of the imperial authorities.
Imperial authorities.
Okay, well, yes, in a way, yes, but I think there is a difference. So imperial authorities didn't really necessarily, or at least up to a point, and then with the war things changed a lot, but there was not necessarily an attempt to homogenize. So inequality and difference within imperial institutions were too much, although there are, you know, all the nuances that Perger clearly points to. But especially before 1919, it remained an arrangement in which homogenization was less important. Here, we have a clear drive towards homogenization that, however, has a structural contradiction or tension within it. So, to me, that would be the difference in that sense. So, you can still talk about ambivalence, but these are two different types of ambivalence, to me at least. Finally, agitators. Yes, we can say a lot of things about agitators, but it's also so there is a perception of the agitator that you see in the archives and you see in the records of the authorities that is somehow motivated by some actors on the ground that actually act in ways that are drawn towards the promotion of irredentist activities, because those existed at the time. But there is also a lot of paranoia as well. So that when you look at the record, for instance, the records that are very interesting in that respect are teachers' evaluations. I found many folders in which the fascist authorities were evaluating teachers and looking at them as to try to see whether they could trust them. And you see that speaking Slovenian is already a reason to be an agitator, even if you speak it not in school but outside in informal situations. So the agitator, the categories of the agitator is very difficult to pin down because the records are so sensitive about it that whoever basically could be an agitator. And even in the quotes that in quotations that I showed, the mass was not made up of agitators, but it could be very easily agitated. So everybody could at some point either be susceptible to propaganda or turn out to be an agitator. So, you know, there is this distinction, and this is also part of this ambivalence. It makes it very hard to actually understand who they had in mind when they were thinking of an agitator. Then you can look at it from the other perspective. So you can look at the records of the minority organizations, for instance, or the representatives, and there see what they were doing and what they, you know, whether they were actually promoting things that could be qualified as agitators, like trying to, you know, threaten state integrity or even promoting terrorism, like attacking at some point in Venezia. And then you have a completely different perspective, of course, because you realize that many of them were just asking for, I don't know, being able to speak Slovenian in the public place or at school, in schools. So in order to have an idea of what are the agitators, you have to put together their different records. But it is also true that most of the records come from the fascist side, so that makes it hard.
Do anyone? Would you? Okay. You do. No, please go ahead. Actually,
it's a short question, I hope, but I need to have it answered. When you are talking about Italian identity or assimilation or Italianization, what was the model? I mean, when we compare it to Germany, it's clear the criteria was race, and from 33 on and so on. So and that was a long tradition of thinking Germany, but also as based on language and romantic. That it was a long history in the 19th century that could be like racialized.
Yes.
After 33, but I didn't get that point for Italy. You talked a lot about language, but not so much maybe about citizenship or what is about race. So because Italy was also created very lately and very conscious of being a heterogeneous state. So what was it, just rhetorics? I mean, was it just they wanted to do like the Germans, or? But then it was before, so I don't. Yeah, I need some.
Yeah. No, sure. It's a very good question. So let's say the model, let's say at least according to some authors, is that precisely because of the diversity in Italy that you mentioned, a strictly speaking biological racial definition of the Italian nation would have been very difficult. So what mostly drove the idea of Italian nationality was precisely the idea of Italian language and culture, this whole heritage, this powerful civilization. So concretely speaking, people had to learn Italian to speak it well, to abandon their own language. So as I said, one of the main elements that was suggested in these teachers' evaluations as a suspect element was that people kept speaking in Slovenian at home, for instance, with their kids, although they were speaking Italian in the school or even outside in public place, but in their private life they were speaking still Slovenian or Croatian or German. And they mostly had to Italianize their name, for instance, so many of these people actually Italianized their name, those at least who wanted to go with the regime. But sometimes that was not enough. So for instance, as I've shown, this person, Albino Furlan, who also changed his name because the name sounds very Italian, or he could have also had already an Italian name because it could have been also the result of a mixed marriage, for instance, from before, so not necessarily the case that he Italianized it and I didn't find necessarily that in the record. But precisely because it was part of an environment that was defined as a Logian or a Slovenian, he wouldn't be completely trusted and be treated as equally as another Italian. So overall, the model was, a kind of cultural assimilation with very strong commitment also towards the regime. You see from these evaluations that, and many of the comments on those who wanted to join the regime or the party, that they had to make an extra effort to show that they were really committed. But then this trust that I mentioned made that it didn't work all the time. That was also dependent also on the specific position of the person. So a lay person that didn't have public charges probably would have been enough if he just she talked Italian and showed that he was committed and assimilated. For somebody who wanted to have some kind of mobility at the social level or within the regime, that would have been harder. And there you can see some more, probably some more ethnic, maybe also with some clues of racial understanding playing a role, but overall it was not the main element that defined what people had to do in order to identify. In other words, there was a chance that actually they had to assimilate. So, you know, even just this idea that they couldn't but assimilate suggests that race in a biological term was not necessarily the main thing. But it doesn't mean that that was the let's say the door for incorporation was completely open all the time.
But if I may, it was actually it's present, but in the very term, I find the term allogyny extremely interesting because it's basically acknowledging that they share the same genes, I mean the same origins basically, but there is something about them that is different, right? And that difference has to be eliminated. I like the title actually, homogenization. It's not the antonym, but homogenizing the allogenous is something you might want to reflect upon, right? Because they're not exact antonyms. It makes me think, perhaps, I was trying to think of similar names assigned to minorities. The Greeks have their homogeny. You know about the Greek homogeny? The Greek homogeny, there is an homogeny law, and there's been an homogeny law ever since the 1920s. The homogenies are basically the ethnic Greeks. Today, it's mainly those who populate the former Soviet Empire, right, or Soviet Union, and they can return to Greece. They will have the nationality, but not the citizenship. So they also have that kind of very liminal status above the ground that they are homogeneous, so basically the ethnic Greeks, but they do not necessarily speak the language, right? So you would find the same kind of ambiguity and the same labels. It would be interesting to trace whether that label was actually deployed at a similar time. I would have a couple of observations and questions. Overall, I find it excellent, and it really speaks to our project. And I really think that we will follow your work, and hopefully in some kind of institutional aliens of some sort, and we can discuss it over time. Perhaps I will be the devil's advocate. 2 or 3 things that I believe don't entirely work. Perhaps the most important one: consistent ambivalence. Right? It's some kind of an oxymoron, so everyone always likes oxymorons in the titles. But I wonder whether, for one thing, all policies in that realm are consistently ambivalent. I mean, you seem to, I think you tend to look at the literature and you use them as strawmen, right? You have that very nice paragraph in which you sum up the literature, and it's one paragraph and you don't expand upon it. And you tend to say that, you know, the Italian case doesn't fit anywhere. But we know that it never fits ideal types, and ideal types are not meant to be fitted, right? So if you think of O'Leary's and Gary's taxonomy, which you discussed, actually 2 of them only are related to migration, right? There are ethnic links in, and there is a second one, population transfers, organized bilateral or multilateral population transfers. So it's not entirely true to say that there is not, in that taxonomy of how states try to eliminate differences, actually there are 2 means that work already. I think you had some more. One of them is internal migration, which is basically reallocating populations within the country. In that respect, it seems to me that there is a 4th theoretical one that you will find in other countries, which is you look at internal emigration of the national majority into the minority land, right? So that it will weaken the cultural means of reproduction. And actually, you would think of France as exactly the other way around. It's more light touch because it's supposed to be a liberal democracy. By the way, if you think that liberal democracies do better when it comes to respect of cultural pluralism, think France at the same time, right? It's purely assimilationist. But there, they use migration. It's basically in those territories that are structurally weak or economically weaker. What they do is that they create an internal market, and it favors immigration. And immigration is what weakens cultural structures in the periphery. So actually it was not so much the weakening and eventually the assimilation into whatever that means to be French, or at least the diffusion of the French language and French norms, etc., into the periphery was rather a product of internal immigration from the periphery to the capital. So you might actually think that theoretically there would be a forefront. And to return to that idea of consistent ambivalence, so you have those ideal types, you know, you have different strategies for eliminating differences, and quite frankly, these are ideal types. And it's never said in theory that they will only use one and completely disregard the others. And it seems to me that for one thing, they have a, so you tend to confuse means and end. The end is not assimilation. The end is homogenization, to have a homogeneous population where national boundaries and territorial boundaries are kind of congruent, right? This is your end. Assimilation is a means to an end. And if you think of it in those terms, then you would find that the three strategies are assimilationist. Assimilation doesn't mean, except if you believe in the ideal type and you want to caricature the rest of the literature, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to assimilate. It means that overall this is what we aim for. But it also means that most likely there will be some residual element who refuse to assimilate. We might actually encourage them or even force them to leave. It also means that it's a strategy where you would acknowledge there would be difficulties, and therefore you would think, well, I would try to create the conditions for a national loyal majority that would have perhaps economic power, right? And that would be more concentrated in the periphery. So that would be a way of thinking of assimilation, not as something that, is a means, it is an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. And not as something that is only means that you would have public schools in the native language and that sort of stuff. I mean, the palette itself is broader. So I would definitely, along those lines, challenge the idea that there is a real ambivalence there. But you're probably right. I'm just trying to poke you a bit because I have to find something to say about what is overall an excellent paper. So we can take another couple of minutes to, if you want to answer.
Yeah, sure.
And then we will go for dinner.
Yeah. So thanks. I mean that's very good advice, and I have to think about this a little bit more calmly. So for what I can say here in this limited amount of time, I would just say that of course you can have if you look at in the paragraph of the second section when I talk about the most common frameworks in the literature, I distinguish between two main positions somehow. One is the inclusion-exclusion, and the other one is Milona's inclusion, exclusion, and accommodation. So that's the two distinction. So the problem with the inclusion-exclusion is not so much that you cannot have inclusion and exclusion at the same time, is that most of the time it's seen as a continuum. So you do see people putting regimes on a line, and on a line at some point you have to choose where you put your dot, and you are either on the side of assimilation or on the side of the exclusion. And of course, all of these assimilation or exclusion is homogenization. I agree with you, but it's if you think in terms of continuum, as many do, it's harder to talk about this contradiction. I mean, you can say that you put a little bit of minus on one side plus, and the result is somewhere on the line, but you have this idea that it's one or the other. Then, in the specific case of Italy, the problem is that, of course, the end result is homogenization. And of course, you can get homogenization either through assimilation or exclusion, so letting people go, for instance. But the problem is that they are claiming that they incorporate them, actually they will incorporate themselves by their own will. So there, admitting that we are excluding them, sending them away, it's a problem. And in that sense also there is a contradiction. And that's the first. And the second one is, we let them in, actually they will come in, but we don't really want them because we distrust them. So in that sense, it's ambivalent. And I think in that sense, it's harder to see it fitting in those frameworks, even in Milona's one.
Mm-hmm.
Because Milona's is about inclusion, exclusion, accommodation. So it is inclusion, they can come in, the door is open, but they have to stay in that corner.
But Larry is better. The taxonomy is more exhaustive. I mean, you have it in the notes, but I think there it solves a.
But anyways, I'm not claiming either that nobody has ever talked about these things. I'm just saying that there are some people who talk it, but it seems to me that it's not properly addressed in most. I mean, some people talk about it, but it's not something that most of the literature I've read takes into account. It seems as if this kind of liminal state is not necessarily on the radar or only for a few authors. So that's the main thing.
Yes,
Jane. In my view, I would like to jump in what you said. In my view, I mean, if we are looking at Italy at an empirical level, early 20th century, obviously, I mean, obviously the fascists had a narrative of homogenized nation. But at the end, if you're looking at the real situation of the country, Christos e fermato ebo, in the 30s, written in the 30s, you see that, I mean, all these fantasies, and the fascists knew it also, were not basically not possible to realize because the differences, the discrepancies within the country, from north to the south, from west to the east, were very, very strong. So to homogenize basically a little area of the northeast is really ridiculous. In my view, if you're looking at the discrepancies within the country.
Right.
But on the other hand, what makes Italy is Renaissance and unification, and basically also the battles in the 40s. The fact that you have with Machiavelli, basically, when he intervened in Florence to the prince, when he wrote his book, he basically wanted him to reunite Italy, because after the loss of the Roman Empire, Italy was always conquered by other units and other countries and other empires. So the long-standing wish within Italian civil religion was how to construct the country again. And there were basically the Renaissance, didn't work. Then the different fights in the early 19th century, which ended in 61, but was incomplete. But the mission was to re-establish basically what was the message of the heritage of the Roman Empire in all its interpretation, from classical ideas to the Renaissance ideas. And obviously, irredentismo would have meant that there are still areas which, in the idea of the unifiers of the 19th century, should have been Italian because there were Italians there, but which were not. And obviously, what we can see and observe there is the reverse issue, because Italy was former colony of Spain, of the Austrians, of the French, and basically turned out to wanted also to have one of these very nice spots under the sun. And this was basically the idea how to get there. But obviously with all these narratively confusions, which were also part of the 19th and 20th centuries. Because it was not, I mean, if you're looking still today at the situation, you will see that there are strong discrepancies within.
Indeed, and that's one thing you say, it's the first time that Italy is confronted to a minority problem, then you have to define minority, because Italy has always had a minority problem of creating Italians out of such a diverse objective, with such diverse, with such huge objective differences, right? So the assimilation already was a strategy, but assimilating into what? Into Italian? What's the Italian language?
I can reply to that. So I didn't define I'm not sure. I don't remember. If I didn't, I forgot about it. But in the project, there is a quite clear definition. So we are looking at national minorities. And by national minority, meaning what basically Baker's definition. So it's a political stand that, in our case, because we accept the idea that a majority can be a minority, as in Flanders, there should be two elements. One, a claim of difference, and it must be a claim of difference. So from that area, there must be political agents which don't necessarily represent the whole population, but they are strong enough, and they get votes or they mobilize a sufficient percentage of the population, and they make a claim of difference based on the idea of sovereignty. So they are a sovereign community that is not identified with the majority sovereign community. So that's one thing, and the other, a claim of, or at least a claim, but also there is also somehow a more part of a category of analysis. There must be a power relations imbalance to be a minority. So in that case, again, Flemings are majority, but in power relations, at least up to the 30s, there is an imbalance because they are lower status, they're poorer, and so on. So that's why they are asking for linguistic equality. And that's mainly the definition we use. So in that sense, Italy before 1919 doesn't have a minority, that kind of minority, because the regional populations that had different languages, although they call them dialects, or the let's say the Slovenians of the Natizone Valley that were integrated in 1866 are not minority because there were no parties, ethnic organizations that were claiming we are a minority, we should have a right to self-determination or autonomy on the basis of we are a different community in national terms.
Neither the Greek in the south or the Albanians in the south.
Not that I know.
Well, thank you very much.
Sorry, I have to.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah. So first, thank you for the presentation. I mean, it was really quite insightful. Coming from Africa and just being exposed to European history, it's quite a lot for me to to reflect on. I'm curious to know what was the tension like between the Dalle and the other group. I can't remember the name of it. Yes, and how are they framed politically in Germany and also in the Kingdom of Croats, Serbs and Slovenes? What was the political reaction to both the Dalle and also like internally, what was the tension like between both groups?
Yeah, so first, just maybe it didn't come across that way. That specific agreement was just for South Tyrol, so it doesn't concern Venetia Giulia. At some point, people were discussing whether we should do a similar agreement with the Kingdom of, at the time it was also called Kingdom of Yugoslavia, it changed its name in 1929. But in the end, Nazar Titosauro, the person I mentioned at the end, didn't believe that was an option because the Yugoslav kingdom was considered as not civilized enough, not having enough resources to come to a similar agreement as the Nazis. Close to parentheses. The line dividing of Tantan and the Bleibers was, well, in terms of social divide, extremely strong. So it was really a traumatic event. As I said, there were families that were divided. You can really see those signs in letters that from the time that were collected by the censorship. So that's why we have a lot of them. Mostly, you can see part of the population that were committed Nazis and they wanted to move to Germany because they believed it was paradise and they had, their somehow, even if it was considered a little bit of a betrayal on the part of Hitler, because Hitler had this policy of bringing minorities within the Reich, German minorities abroad, so South Tyrol should have been incorporated within the Reich. And that was an exception, but still, people who were part of Nazi organizations in South Tyrol, they were willing to go over that and just, go to Germany, move, being among Germans, even enroll in the army or contribute to the economy, whatever. The only request that the Optanten were making, and in the negotiations also with the Nazi organizations, they were making a point about that, was they wanted to be settled together, and that was a problem for the Nazis. They had to find a solution, or at least to make as if they could settle as many South Tyroleans together in a similar area somewhere else within the Reich. So there were many plans. Actually, there were promoters who were showing pictures of areas in, after the beginning of the war in Poland, in Galicia, for instance, or in Carinthia, which they were showing pictures of farms that have been emptied from either Polish people or Slovenian people who were living in Carinthia or Austria, because at the time it was a Slovenian minority in Carinthia. So they were promoting this kind of places in which the population would settle, would even reconstruct the same village with the same name, and so there was this kind of utopia that we will move, we will find the same environment there. So that's how also the Nazis were selling this to the Tantan. And one of the problems is that the first move, because it was a time scale between more or less June, July 39 to December when people could choose. So some moved already quite early on, and then we're writing back saying, well, things are not exactly as they described them, so people, had to feed and so on. But some also voted in favor of that just because they wanted to oppose the regime, or because they believed in the rumors that the Nazi propaganda was spreading, so that those who would remain would be deprived of their property, that they would be moved to southern Italy, and so on and so forth. So it was a mix of things, and then especially towards the end, towards December, when they saw that the regime was kind of, turning back, there was also people who were voting but hoping that they wouldn't have to move. So it was a kind of political statement, We vote against, because after these last 20 years we've been, oppressed, and we would never vote for Italy. So if you have to choose, we choose Germany. Also because people who didn't vote, it was assumed that we would like to stay in Italy. So not voting was a vote for Italy. So people voted also for that, but they didn't really want to move. And that actually became a reality after, because after the end of the term, many people dragged their feet and basically did everything possible to try to stay. And the Dableibers, so one interesting thing is that, as I said, a big chunk of the old leadership of the German speakers, so the traditional parties that somehow dominated politically the area before Nazi organizations came out in the 30s, those were in favor of staying. They didn't want to leave because it's also, and that talks a lot also to the different forms of identification that there were in South Tyrol and how they changed throughout time. So when South Tyrol was annexed, many people in South Tyrol, at least from what we can guess at from the records, identified first and foremost with Tyrol. So they wanted Tyrol to stay united. Their first form of identification was with the region of Tyrol. Then there was a form of identification with Austria, especially with kind of imperial identification with the imperial part of the Austrian part of the empire, and there was also an identification with the German community, let's say, especially in cultural terms. But then slowly, throughout time, especially in late 20s and beginning of the 30s, people started identifying ever more with this idea of, a German nation or a German race, and that became very strong in the 30s. So you see in the political leadership of the region also a clash between the old leadership, which was much more Tyrol focused and even forms of identification for Tyrol, and one that is much more pro-German, and therefore for those, moving is an option, for the others is not, although the old guard were the arch enemies of the regime. So at some point they find themselves on the same side of the regime, and that becomes a problem for them because they call them traitors, and the other call them Nazis, and it's a very fluid, complex situation.
Well, thank you very much for everyone's questions and interest.